Hello YouTube, welcome back to Brunger Builds. Today, I'll be attempting a screen-accurate Empire Strikes Back paint job on this Book of Boba Fett helmet sculpt from the Galactic Armory. Alright, for starters, this is a paid file from the Galactic Armory. I will link it, as well as all the other materials I used, down in the description below. As a quick side note, I'm also licensed by the Galactic Armory to sell their prints. So if you're at all interested in having a helmet built by yours truly, reach out. My email is in the description. I started off this build like any other, just doing a quick pass with some rough grit sandpaper to remove any rough spots on the print, and then quickly moved on to using my trusty wood filler. I've gotten a lot of comments on my past videos saying that I should try using UV resin to fill my prints. And although that seems like a slightly faster method, I just don't really like the idea of having a bunch of toxic dust floating around my garage. And in the long run, I don't really feel like this wood filler method impedes the flow of my builds very much, since I usually fill my helmets first and then move on to prepping my resin prints. And by the time I'm done prepping and priming my resin prints, the wood filler is usually dry. So maybe one day I'll try the resin trick, but first I'll have to install a state-of-the-art ventilation system. When it comes to cleaning up the supports on my resin prints, I'll typically use 150 or 180 grit sandpaper. And if I'm sanding anything that needs to look pretty but has a few layer lines, I'm usually using 320 or 400 grit. The right and left ears on the Book of Boba Fett helmet have some details that are indented in the surface of the prints, rather than painted on like they are in Empire Strikes Back. I decided to use some Milliput epoxy putty to fill in these indents, but first I drilled some tiny holes so that the putty would have something to grab onto. And once I had mixed the putty, I just jammed it down into those holes and made sure it was as smooth as possible on the surface, knowing that I would come back later to sand it. This putty is like a rock once it's set, but it spreads really nicely if you just add a dab of water to your tool. And again, because it dries so hard, I made sure to remove it from any area I didn't want it to be, so that the cleanup would be a lot easier. Once the wood filler is dry, I'll use some 120 grit sandpaper to knock down any high points on the filler, and once I'm getting closer to my layer lines, I'll switch to 220. Even though I like to joke about how much time I have to spend sanding, I probably only spent about 30 to 45 minutes on this step, and then it was on to priming. And speaking of priming, I have an announcement to make. I'm officially switching from Rust-Oleum's 2-in-1 Sandable Filler Primer to Rust-Oleum's Filler Primer. I bought this stuff on a whim just to test it out, and I gotta say, even though it flows a lot runnier out of the can, it dries much harder than the 2-in-1 primer and is a lot nicer to sand, and it doesn't gum up your sandpaper like the 2-in-1 does. Anyway, just thought I'd throw that out there just in case you're looking for a new filler primer. Here's the helmet after a couple heavy coats and one pass of sanding from 220 up to 400 grit. At this point on my channel, I feel there's not a project that goes by where I'm not doing at least some form of metal effects. And so if you're new to the channel, I'll first say I always start out with a coat of semi-gloss black. And because all the metal on Boba Fett's helmet is a pretty light metal, I used Vallejo's white aluminum for all the pieces. This was only my second time trying to airbrush the metal color, and I definitely feel like I had much greater success here since I lowered my PSI down to about 9 or 10. I also did very light passes and slowly built up the coat of silver. Alright, from this point on, I'll be telling the story of this build a bit out of order, since I feel like for organization's sake, it'll be a lot easier to go section by section on the helmet, rather than bouncing around like I actually had to do. So to start, I just used a bottle of liquid latex to do some masking for the paint chipping on the left ear. For my weathering reference, I was using stencils created by RafalFett. These stencils are super detailed, and I'll be sure to leave a link to them in the description. Initially, I thought that I would try to replicate the weathering on the helmet exactly as it appears on screen, but the further I got in the process, I just realized it was going to be next to impossible to exactly replicate every scratch. I did try to stay true to the location of the scratches though, but the shaping of them is not exact. I have seen some people replicate it exactly, but I just did not have the time for that. Anyway, on to the first real coat of paint. I looked around online, but had a heck of a time trying to find exact color match recipes for Vallejo paint, so I decided to just do my best and eyeball everything. And so going forward, aside from the dome and the lower cheeks on the helmet, every color has been custom mixed by me. and I'll do my best to show every color that I used. I should also say that I don't have an exact recipe for any of these colors, since I was just mixing until it looked right to my eye, and the only thing I was really keeping in mind was that the paint tends to dry a bit darker than it looks coming straight out of the bottle. After a bit more masking and liquid masking, I shot this upside down U with white. I then went back over the exposed metal with Vallejo's Fire Red. Alright, onto the right ear, which gets a coat of gray and then yellow. For the gray, I just used Vallejo's Panzer Dark Gray right out of the bottle, and it was actually on this color that I learned that the paint tends to dry darker than it actually looks. The gray on the original helmet is actually a bit lighter and a bit bluer in color, but for the sake of time, I just decided to continue on since the colors were close enough. Now, because I want a multi-layer paint chipping effect on this piece, I'm going over my liquid masking with some more liquid masking, making sure that the new masking flows over the edges of the old masking just a hair. That way, once the paint has dried and the masking has been removed, you'll be able to see both layers of paint in different spots. I'm also completely covering this upside down U shape so that it maintains the gray color throughout the process. And here are the two yellows I mixed up for my color. Again, nothing super scientific, just mixing until it looked right. Once the paint was dry, I pulled off that liquid masking and painted a few little details with black. Now, the Book of Boba Fett ears are a slightly different shape than the Empire Strikes Back version. And in order to make sure that the Empire Strikes Back stencils worked on these ears, I had to do a little bit of photoshopping, and I used RafalFett stencils as a base. The photoshopping wasn't anything intense, it was just making sure that the height and width of these stencils matched the newer ears. I then had my buddy Sparky Mark cut out these modified files on his Cricut. Then it was off to the paint booth for some very gentle airbrushing. The Cricut had a bit of a hard time cutting out these super tiny squares, and so I just touched them up with my brush. You can also see that I applied just a little bit of liquid masking around the edges of these stencils so that they came out with a weathered look. Alright, now onto the helmet. Like I said earlier, I'm telling this story a bit out of order, and so actually what I was doing was bouncing back and forth between doing a layer on the helmet and a layer on the ears, just trying to be as efficient as possible with my time. And speaking of efficiency, I've seen most people paint this helmet one section at a time, but I figured because all these layers share the same base layer of silver and then gray, I could paint the gray layer first and then work section by section. I feel like doing it this way might have saved me a little bit of time, but ultimately I'm not sure if it was really any better of a way to do things, and so if I ever build this helmet again, I'll probably try doing it like everybody else does it. And again, this gray dried maybe a little bit too dark, but because I had already painted the ear pieces, I wanted to keep the grays consistent across all the pieces, and so I decided not to repaint and just to move on. Okay, so the first unique color that this section gets is this sort of grayish tan color. I've seen people lean more towards the tan side of things, and other people lean more towards the gray side of things, so I tried to sort of split the difference and got this Vallejo Deck Tan. I think it's a pretty good match for this part, but maybe it could have been a hair darker. Anyway, once that paint had dried, I removed the liquid masking and then reapplied that liquid mask. This definitely felt pretty inefficient to me, but in my tests with the right ear, it seemed like when I applied masking over top of the existing masking and then pulled that off, the detail in both paint chipping areas was not as fine, almost like the masking was pulling away a bit too much of the paint than it should have. And so because I wanted a bit more fine detail in the rest of the sections, I just opted to apply and then remove and then reapply as needed. On to the final layer of paint for the back section. It's this sort of dark bluish teal color. This actually took me a few tries to get right, and in the end, I think I went a little too dark again. And the footage that you're actually seeing right now is the first layer that I laid down and didn't like it, so without removing the liquid mask, I just painted again. On camera, it definitely looks a lot closer to the color of the base gray, but once I had removed that liquid masking and then later on down the line painted the black on the cheeks, that black really helped differentiate the different tones. And so even though it was a bit too dark, it still reads as blue, and so I was happy with it. Now on to the dome and lower cheeks. This was the one color that I did not eyeball, and I used the recipe from Bounty Ewok. I'll link his thread in the description, but I felt like he got really close to the right color, so instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, I just went with his recipe. So at this point in the video, I'm sure you're beginning to realize that this is quite the tedious and repetitive process, and I agree with you. But I just had to keep reminding myself to trust the process and forge on. Here are the two colors that I started off with. I mixed both of these, and then honestly, I've lost track of all the colors I added to this mix. There was some black, there was some gray, there was some blue, there was some brown. I think I might have even added a little bit of green. Regardless, I spent a lot of time trying to get these colors right. And I think I almost got there. Like with all the other colors on this build, I think I went a bit too dark, and that's mostly just due to the fact that the paint dried a bit darker. But overall, I was happy with the look and just moved on. Here I'm painting the lighter shade of red, which was also an amalgamation of multiple colors. So once I was happy with the two colors on this back plate, I moved on to the helmet. First starting with that dark brownish red, and once that had dried, adding more liquid masking, and then painting the lighter red on top. Now I was in the final stretch, and using a stencil and a little bit of liquid masking, I laid down the kill stripes. On the Empire Strikes Back variant of this helmet, these kill stripes have a subtle orange shift, starting from yellow at the front and moving towards orange at the back. In order to replicate that look, I first laid down my yellow coat and then added a bit of orange into my airbrush and just lightly misted the back. In the end, I think I kind of overdid the blending, but if you're really looking at it, you can see the subtle shift. Now the upper cheeks were probably the easiest paint mix on this whole build. I just added a hair of dark green into my black. Not enough to really see the green, but just enough to shift that black away from true black. And after some more liquid masking, I sprayed it on there. While that black coat was drying, I quickly threw on some window tint to some PET sheet. I then scraped this circle clean for his cheek greebly, and making sure not to get any glue on the rangefinder, I installed the ear cap. And then it was time for weathering. I say this in every one of my videos, but don't be afraid to use the cheapest possible acrylics that you can find. I almost always start the weathering stage with an oily brown wash. Then depending on how much of the wash I want to stay, I'll use a damp rag or a dry rag to wipe it off. Once I'm happy with that initial wash layer, I move on to my all-time favorite weathering technique. If you've been watching me for a while, you're probably sick of hearing me say this, but using pastel chalks is my all-time favorite technique for weathering. Here I'm building up a rust layer on the stock of the rangefinder, starting with a brown, moving to a brownish orange, and then finally a light stippling of bright orange. For the rust effect, I mix this chalk with some matte Mod Podge that has not been watered down, so that it stays a bit gunky. The nice thing is that if you let this set a bit and dry, you can then go back with a damp rag and kind of remove some of it, which gives it a more natural look. This chalk is really great because it lends itself well to building up into a thick layer of gunk, but if you water down the Mod Podge with some water or IPA, you can just leave a nice dusty coating over your piece. Here you can see that I'm laying it on pretty thick, and then once it's dried just a hair, I go back with a damp rag to wipe most of it off. This makes sure that it really only stays in the nooks and crannies. This process is also really forgiving because if you put too much on, you can easily wipe it away, and also if you wipe too much off, you can easily apply more. But finally, after lots of dabbing and wiping, this helmet was ready for its glamour shots. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. This project was a pretty tedious undertaking, but in the end, the results were worth it, and I'm extremely proud of the final product. If you'd like to see more from me, make sure to subscribe. Despite the fact that I'm consistently late on my upload schedule, I still plan to drop a video every Saturday. Finally, I'd like to say a quick thank you to the almost 3,400 people who have subscribed to this point. It means a lot that there are people out there interested in watching me work, and I appreciate your viewership. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good day.